In 2019, Stephen Cohen, in conversation with Katrina Vanden Newell and Dan Rudder, discussed the book War with Russia, From Putin and Ukraine to Trump and Russiagate. The book is an alternative narrative of Donald Trump's US and Putin's Russia, from America's most prominent Russian scholar. The book says that America is in a new Cold War with Russia, even more dangerous than the one the world barely survived in the 20th century. The Soviet Union is gone, but the two nuclear superpowers are again locked in political and military confrontations, now from Ukraine to Syria. All of this is exacerbated by Washington's warlike demonizing of the Kremlin leadership and by Russiagate's unprecedented allegations. According to Cohen, U.S. mainstream media accounts are highly selective and seriously misleading. American disinformation, not only Russian, is a growing peril.
Then, and kind of an ongoing lament that I feel because I've been part of the media for decades. I worked for CBS, I wrote a column for The Nation magazine, but I think the media is not doing its job today in covering Russian-American relations. It always faltered sometimes, but this is the worst, I would call it media malpractice I have ever seen. And I mean the mainstream. I mean, there are many exceptions, but I'm talking about those outlets on which most of us depend. And finally, and this will be, if you all, again, I can't see the ages, but those of you all who are a certain age will remember that during the last Cold War, there was a very well mainstream organized opposition to the Cold War in the United States. It included heads of some of the major American corporations. It included aides to presidents. It included members of Congress. It included people who ran for president, that they were opposed to the Cold War, and they debated what could be done about it. There is no public debate in the mainstream today. It's one hand clapping. And that, to me, in my lifetime, is a radical change, and it's a concern that runs through this little book, and it's one reason that I changed the title. I had a different title in mind and called it War with Russia, ? Because in my long career of being involved in Russian-American relations as a scholar and a participant, I think our relations with Russia today are more dangerous than they have ever been, even including the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which we would all agree was the closest we came to nuclear war. So I am very, very worried. And if you don't want to be worried, you probably shouldn't read the book.
Stephen F. Cohen is the widely acclaimed historian of Soviet and post-Soviet Russia.
So today, I see in the discourse accusations that those of us who dissent from American policy. For example, I believe the Ukrainian crisis was not, as it's called in the newspapers regularly, Putin's aggression against Ukraine or an invasion, but it was triggered by the American-led attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO. And it was inevitable as any crisis imaginable when you understood what was going on. That, to me, is a kind of scholarly argument. That comes from studying what happened before. But when I made it, and not I alone, immediately came a torrent of charges that we were apologists for Putin in the Kremlin, that we were Putin's best friend, and all sorts of things like that. And lamely, the only answer I could come up with is no, I'm an apologist for American national security, and what we did in Ukraine gravely damages our national security. But the fact that you have to fight your way through these accusations makes it really hard to get traction, particularly in the mainstream. So in that sense, and maybe McCarthy isn't quite the right word, but it's that slurring of people. Now, I'll end on this note. I don't know this to be true, but I've heard it from friends I have who are still active at universities, training students, that students are self-censoring. They sense out there a marketplace, and they need the marketplace. They have to raise their families, which is not receptive to people who stray too far from the mainstream consensus. That would be the worst thing that could happen, because we want our young people to think as freely as possible. That's the privilege of being young.
True.
Though I'm taking it back for myself, but nonetheless, that really worries me. And so that too is a kind of what I observed at Columbia when I came in the early 60s, how these older professors of mine were still very careful and warned us to be careful. It's that kind of thing that I call neo-McCarthyism. But I mean, again, things are generational, and I may exaggerate because of my own life experiences. I mean, you obviously feel that you don't see you were there then too. You sense something different, not the same.
In his book, War with Russia, he gives readers a very different, dissenting narrative of this more dangerous new Cold War. From its origin in the 1990s, the actual role of Vladimir Putin, and the 2014 Ukrainian crisis, to Donald Trump's election and today's unprecedented Russiagate allegations.
Well, in the book Intelgate, I've obviously made a play on words from Russiagate to IntelligenceGate. And I'll tell you how I came on this. You all know this so-called Steele dossier, right? You all have heard about it. This former British, if he is really former, intelligence agent who was posted in Moscow and had a big Russia profile over the years, was hired, it said, to put together negative things about Trump's relationship with Russia. So because I have some Russian expertise, I began to look into this. And the first thing I discovered, the document's about 30 or 40 pages long. There are so many mistakes in it that it doesn't seem like the mistakes that Russian intelligence would make. I mean, they had people alive who were dead and people who were in positions that they hadn't held. But anybody can make a mistake like that. But I did come to the conclusion that there was nothing in this document that suggested it had come from Russian sources, because that was Steele's claim, that he had this network who were forming. Then I asked myself another question. If Putin is really the horrible master of, bloodthirsty, ruthless master of the Kremlin he's said to be, I don't think he is, how could anybody in the Kremlin, knowing, allegedly, that Putin favored Trump in the election, allegedly, I'm actually not sure that's true either, there's a question mark. How could any ranking intelligence officials in or around the Kremlin defy Putin and abet an anti-Trump cause in America? They were putting certainly their careers and their families' well-being at risk. So then we were told by the guy who hired Steele that Steele had paid these people. So I thought, well, maybe Russians need money. But then later Simpson, the guy who hired Steele, testified to Congress that Steele hadn't been paid and none of his sources had been paid. So I was left with a document, and by the way, this is the document on which our own intelligence sources base their own so-called assessment, that this document had little validity for a working historian. And we often get documents written at a certain period, either published or in an archive. We can't just accept the document because it's a document. You or I can write a document tonight and dump it in an archive, and some historian wouldn't know we were kidding. It'll have authenticity. I couldn't find any authenticity to this Steele dossier. And then when you trace its history, the hands of John Brennan and British intelligence were all over the origins, not only of the document, of Steele himself. So I began to ask, what role did our intelligence services play in these allegations that Trump was a kind of puppet of the Kremlin? And let me end by saying that I would never make this as a flat statement. It's a question. And I think I think I titled the thing Intelgate or Russiagate with a question mark. But since nobody was asking the question, nobody had done the legwork, I thought it very important to raise the question. And all I can say is that since then, the behavior of the FBI and the CIA have become, to say the least, more and more peculiar as we learn more things about what the FBI was doing. So many people have been fired from the FBI for one reason or another. Last point about history. So Katrina, being much younger than myself, nonetheless remembers, as the keeper of the liberal progressive flame in America, there was a time, her lifetime too, when liberals and progressives were deeply suspicious of the American intelligence agencies.
Including the FBI.
including
the FBI. Yeah.
So you all sitting out there remember this. Even if we think it to be true, we have to ask, how did it happen that liberals and progressives today are embracing the FBI and the CIA in their war against Trump? That's a historical question. How do we get from there to here? One explanation is the loathing for Trump. I understand that. But I don't think it's explanation enough. I mean, liberals have come a long way from wanting, the church committee, from wanting to expose abuses. I mean, the CIA was running assassination plots. We learned this in the church. You covered this church committee, right? Well, maybe you can say something about it. My memory's not that great. But we've come a very, very long way as a kind of mainstream liberal, enlightened, democratic society from having a healthy skepticism about what our intelligence services were doing to embracing them as fonts of wisdom about Trump. I mean, does loathing for Trump justify that transformation? And when Trump's gone, the intelligence services will still be here.
Because of his views, Stephen Cohen is said to be the America's most controversial Russia expert. Some say this to denounce him, others to laud him as a bold, highly informed critic of U.S. policies and the dangers they have helped to create. I am Lovely Montoya of Manila STV.